3 years ago, me and all my girlfriends were single for most of the year. When it came time to celebrate my birthday, I told the girls that I wanted to go dancing. There was this sort of newish club that had opened downtown, and it seemed like an awesome way to celebrate my 26th. We just wanted to dance and not really worry about relationships or any of that stuff that could potentially just ruin the evening, and no toxic relationships on that night. Well, instead of a night of fun and dancing that I could remember forever, I instead left with a memory that is burned into my brain for all the wrong reasons. And maybe this story isn't your typical scary story, but if you were in my shoes, I bet that you would feel a certain way as well. The night started great, just as I wanted. We danced like we were never going to dance again, and we were all wearing some pretty cute dresses and heels, and I couldn't imagine the night really going any better. But that's when the power went out. Like it just completely died. It was so dark in the club that you just couldn't see your hand in front of your face. And I hate the dark, especially that kind of darkness. But honestly, in this specific situation, it was actually kind of funny. Everyone was screaming and just sort of shouting in joy, and it turned into sort of a makeshift mosh pit of sorts. Everyone was laughing and continued singing the song that was playing before the blackout. It was almost as if the nightclub sort of engineered this moment. You would think a blackout like this, with all those people, would induce a fear reaction, but instead, it was the weird moment of joy. During the loud blackout mosh pit, I thought that I heard someone crying, but I couldn't focus on the voice due to all the shouting going on around me. Then I heard the sound of a blood-curdling loud scream. It was the only time in my life that I felt like I could hear pain and life being drained in just that scream. And just writing it down now is reminding me of it, and it just sends a shiver down my spine. I tried grabbing one of my friends, but it was just too dark to see. I pulled out the flashlight on my phone, and with the little bit of light that it was giving off, it was clear that nobody cared about it, and especially my friends. As I was trying to get my attention of a friend, I heard someone behind me scream, "Help!" It was that same voice of whoever just had that loud scream seconds before. I turned around, but I couldn't make out anyone in distress. It was just so dark, and with everyone jumping around and being loud, it was impossible to focus on anything. Everyone just kept laughing, singing. I think due to the nature of the situation, everyone just assumed someone was making a joke and nobody really cared. This was just part of the party. A lot of people had their phone lights out now, and they were jumping up and down, creating this weird strobe effect. I needed to get out of the club. Maybe it was just the darkness getting to me, but I felt like I was having an anxiety attack. I grabbed one of my friend's arms and basically dragged her outside with me. And she knew something was wrong, and she put her arm around me. I told her I needed air, and I mentioned to her that I heard someone screaming and saying help. She told me she heard it too, but according to her, it just didn't seem serious. She just assumed it was someone clowning around playing a joke since it was so dark in the inside of the club. She even used the word paranoid to describe my emotions at that moment, and I have to say I wasn't pleased. I tried describing the scream to her, and she didn't hear it the way that I did, but she did admit that she wasn't really paying attention. If I hadn't heard the crying sound before, I may not have thought that the scream was as bad as it was. And a couple of minutes had gone by, and before we knew it, the club was surrounded by dozens of sirens. Police cars and ambulances were flooding the outside of the club. We looked on trying to figure out what was happening, and we saw several EMTs run inside with a stretcher. It was conveniently around this time that the power had gone back on in the club, and just then, we heard the sounds of screams and gasps coming from inside the club, and the music cut off almost as soon as it turned back on. When we tried to re-enter the club, there was a cop who wouldn't let us back in, and a couple of minutes later, the EMTs were coming out with someone on a stretcher that looked completely unconscious. We noticed from the doorway that the cops inside had a few people apprehended, and they were also interviewing some people as well. We tried eavesdropping, but we couldn't hear anything. The person on the stretcher was put into the ambulance, and they drove off quickly with the sirens blaring. What's crazy about all this is that it happened in the span of like a minute or two. It definitely put a sour taste in my mouth for my birthday. Truthfully, I don't think whatever happened that night was an accident, which is what my friends think. I think someone with intent and malice hurt a targeted individual. Why else would the police have suspects apprehended? I mean, it was within seconds of the power going out that I heard the crying and then the scream, and I never saw anything else followed up on this. And I'm just writing this now because I'm curious. Do you think I'm crazy, or do you agree with me? Or do you think it was a setup from the beginning?
As I was passing by the Chuck E. Cheese outlet in my town, I was instantly reminded of a horror that I experienced when I was 16 years old. We were famous as the weird trio in the school. There were a total of 3 girls in the group: me, Susan, Bennett, and Carla. The reason they called us weird was that we were the only ones among our age group who still used to go out to Chuck E. Cheese. But our motto was to enjoy our life the way you want before you become an adult, so we didn't let others come in the way of our enjoyment. Carla's birthday was coming in next week, and she was going to go to her grandparents' house for a huge celebration. They lived in a complete different city from ours, so she was to leave 2 days prior her birthday, and we weren't able to celebrate it alongside her. So Bennett and I decided to throw an awesome pre-birthday party for her the day before she was to leave. We planned the party to be at Chuck E. Cheese at night, when there won't be many people around except employees, so that we could enjoy freely. We told Carla to meet us after her cram school around 8 p.m., and we ourselves went half an hour earlier to prepare. We first bought gifts for her, a bracelet from Bennett and a watch from me, and a few balloons just so she could tell it's her birthday. The 3 of us met at the entrance gate and head inside. The closing time for Chuck E. Cheese was between 10 p.m. and 10:30 p.m., so we told the employees beforehand that we would be spending approximately 3 hours there. The first thing we did was to give her the presents, and then the 3 of us stuffed some pizza. And then we started to play arcade games. As we were so lost playing games, we did not realize that everyone had left the place except for us, so we decided to leave as well. And as we were leaving, the gates automatically shut down in front of our faces. We tried opening, but it did not open. When the door did not open, we tried calling for the employees, but nobody came. After that, we started banging the door. As we were banging the door, all of a sudden the power went for a minute or so, and then it was back. We turned our heads to see that Bennett wasn't there, so we started calling her out, but it was no use. We looked around, but she wasn't there. That was when power cut happened, and this time I had held Carla's hand so that doesn't disappear as well. Light came back, and I turned around to see Carla, but she wasn't there. Instead, I was holding her arm that had been cut down from her body. I freaked out and immediately left the hand. I was trembling from the terror that I was feeling at the moment. I could not understand that I did not hear even a sound when this happened. As I was trying to find the other 2, I saw a man in the Chuck E. Cheese mascot coming towards me. I panicked and instantly ran and hid. The man in the mascot effortlessly looked for me around 15 minutes or so, and then turned toward the kitchen. I thought that if I follow him without making a noise, maybe I would be able to find my friends. So I sneakily followed him, and then hid near a place where I was not in the sight. I tried to look what he was up to, when I noticed Bennett, who was tied with ropes, and her mouth was wrapped with tape so she cannot scream. The man pulled out a huge butcher knife and cut her fingers first. I could tell by her eyes how painful it must have been. She passed out from the pain. I was trembling and too terrified to move from the place or help her. He then waited for her to regain consciousness, and when she did, he cut one of her ears. He kept repeating the process. He would wait for her to regain consciousness, and as soon as she starts to move, he would cut off another body part. Soon after, she stopped waking up, and it looked like she had died. He noticed her being dead and started to remove the costume. When he came out of the Chucky mascot, he started to unbuckle his pants. He looked like someone who was in his late 30s. He then raped her dead body twice and then left. I was petrified from the horror that I had just witnessed. When he was finished, he stood up and walked to a corner which was hardly on my sight, but I could tell that Carla must have been there. I heard a sound of the man falling, and then saw Carla running off from the kitchen while holding her half-cut hand. Looked like she was barely holding the unbearable pain. The man followed her, and within a minute, they vanished near the bathroom. I grabbed some courage and got up. I was not able to save Bennett, but I wanted to save Carla. I took out my phone and dialed 911. When I told them about the situation, they asked me to manage it for 10 minutes and they will be there soon. I walked towards the bathroom when I saw Carla coming in my direction. She looked relieved after seeing me, and that's when I saw the man coming from behind. I shouted, telling Carla to run. Carla noticed him coming from behind and ran towards me. As she caught up to me, I held her hand and we ran toward the entry gate, but the gates were still locked. The police had already been reached and they were trying to get inside. That's when the mascot man caught us and knocked Carla unconscious. He swung the knife over me. That's when I heard a gunshot and passed out from the fear. The next day, I woke up in the hospital. Luckily, I hadn't received any injuries, and Carla was in the ER getting surgery for a cut-off hand. That's when I heard the news that was playing on the hospital TV. The psychotic murder. George was shot dead when he tried to kill two 16-year-old girls and had already murdered one in Chuck E. Cheese. My 20th birthday was definitely one to remember. Firstly, it was the first birthday I celebrated with a night on the town. From May 18th and 19th, me and my mates were all too broke to drop any serious cash anywhere, so we contented ourselves by getting sloshed in the park or in one of our bedrooms. By the time I hit 20, we could actually afford a proper night out. Needless to say, it was one of the best nights of my life. I was always a bit nervous about clubbing. We hear some horror stories about people getting spiked or glassed and roughed up by bouncers. But we ended up having a great night, a relatively tame one, I'm sure, but it was still one of the best nights of my life, right up until it turned into one of the worst. Turns out we had such a good time that none of us remembered to keep any taxi fare in reserve. So when the time came for the club lights to come on and the bouncers started kicking people out, we realized that if we wanted to go home, we were walking. It wasn't all that far, but given how drunk we were, an hour's walk would be more like an hour and a half, maybe 2. So we set off, causing chaos as we walked down the center of dead streets, stealing traffic cones as we went. There were 5 of us when we started the walk, but gradually we were hitting people's houses on our route, and the group got smaller and smaller until it was just me and my friend Chris. As I said, I know this was stupid, but since it was like 4:30 in the morning and the roads were all but deserted, we were just stumbling around down the middle of the road, which was why I suppose I shouldn't have been surprised when we're blinded by some car's headlights as it came speeding around the corner at us. We tried our best to dodge it, but I'm pretty sure the driver swerved too. But the car ended up clipping my mate's hip with the impact spinning him like a top right there in the road. The car screeches to a stop, and I hear the driver's door open, and then the sound of my mate groaning from the impact. I look up and see the driver walking toward me, and I'm already apologizing him, which strikes me in the most British thing ever. Now that I think about it, I got my phone out, and I'm literally plugging 999 onto the touchscreen. So when I see the driver with his phone out, I tell him like, "Nah man, I'm calling the ambo, don't worry about it." But he didn't get his phone out to call the paramedics, because the next thing I know, he's pointing his phone at me before the flash suddenly blinds me. He'd taken a picture of me. Then he did the same with Chris, angled his phone to get a good picture of his face too. And that's when I realized something was wrong. Well, more wrong than getting clipped by a car. Not only did the bloke take a picture of us, he didn't seem in the least bit concerned that he just hit one of us. He just took his photos and started looking around like he was lost or something. I later realized that he was probably just looking for witnesses or cameras, but at the time, he looked completely mental, and given that he wasn't helping us, I started to get angry. "Mate, what are you doing? Give us a hand here." I remember saying I wanted them to help move Chris out of the road, not knowing that's the opposite of what you're supposed to do. But instead of even trying to help, he pulls his hood up, turns around to us, and starts showing us the pictures he'd taken of us on his phone. Not a word to anyone about this. "We know what you look like, and we'll be coming for you if you talk." I remember thinking that he just didn't want to get into trouble. Maybe he was appointed to away from a driving ban, and to drunk lads walking in the middle of the roads weren't going to be the thing that took him down. Shocked when not surprised. People could be mega scummy when they want to be, but then something happened. I started realizing that the noise my mate was making sounded way more muffled than it should have been. And then in actuality, he hadn't been making any noise at all. He must have landed almost right on his chin because he was knocked out cold. So if it wasn't him that was making the noise, who was? And as the driver walked back to his car, that's when the penny dropped. The muffled groaning noise wasn't coming from my mate. They were coming from the boot of his fella's car. Before the horror of what was happened could really sink in, the wheels of the car screeched before it sped off the road. There were a few seconds where I think I was just in pure shock. It wasn't until I could hear the 999 operator talking on the phone that I came to and just hung up. I was too afraid, and I thought blokes only locked people in air boots doing cartoonish Guy Ritchie films. I didn't think it actually happened for real. And I'm incredibly claustrophobic to the idea of being locked in the booth. It's an actual living nightmare for me. I just stayed there, kneeling next to Chris until he suddenly came to. He had a few cuts and abrasions inside his mouth, which looked a bit scary because of all the blood. But it turned out that he'd be fine. He had some horrible bruising on his hips the next day, probably a concussion. But he was good to walk home, even if it was pretty painful. Thank God for the booze that keeps you lumber, and I don't think I'd have been able to get him home. Otherwise, he didn't remember what happened at all. I guess as a result of being killed and knocked that memory out real quick. But I promised to tell him when he was sober. The next day, I caught him as he was about to go to the local walk-in treatment center with his mom. It took some explaining, but once it made it very clear that some very, very bad things might happen to us if we reported that what happened was a hit and run. He started to relent. It didn't matter if we were in the middle of the road. The car had hit him and then bailed, which was something that the police would be very keen on investigating, and I needed him to admit those details. And if that was the case, some very bad man had actual pictures of us, stuff they could distribute if they really needed to. We'd never be safe. They could just put a price on our heads or something, and desperate enough for the cash would just take us out. That's how it is around here. And that's how Chris ended up insisting to his mom that what had happened to him was just when he got a little too sloshed and took a tumble down some steps. That's all they really need to know, and they will just go from there and treat him as need be. But a few days of mild pain were considerably preferable to what I was fearing of a permanent dirt nap. And so just like we were told, we kept our golf shots and kept our health. After all, I was worried that if we blabbed about what we'd seen, neither of us would be around to see my 21st.
These are two accounts of the most scared I have ever been. Both happened while I was stationed in Afghanistan. The first happened in late 2011 in a place called Helmand Province, Afghanistan. I was standing posts on a small 8-man patrol base at about 2 a.m. in the morning. The posts consisted of 4 plywood walls, bulletproof glass, and multiple sandbags. I have been up for about 24 hours at this point and was starting to hallucinate through my NVGs. mildly seeing school buses and the like, when all of a sudden, bang. I first thought it was a round, hitting the bulletproof glass. I realized about a second later that it was a rock. Immediately on high alert, adrenaline flowing, I scan the area with my thermals and get no heat signatures from anywhere. The strange part was that we had double-stacked razor wire about 30 meters out from the post, and it was all open ground for about 30 meters past that. So any rock thrown would have had to have been amazing. I caught up to the center of command and had them use a big thermal camera on a stick to scan the area in case I missed something. They got nothing. At this point, I'm kind of freaking out, thinking that there's someone out there that I can't see, but they can see me. 10 or 15 minutes go by, and I'm starting to relax a little bit, thinking maybe a bird flew into the glass or something like that. When all of a sudden, bang. Now this time, it sounded 2 times louder. I get a feeling of pure terror and feel adrenaline flush through my whole body. I've got my rifle at the ready, PEQ laser on, looking harder than I've ever looked before. Every piece of micro-terrain that a human could be hiding behind. And still, I couldn't see anything. I freaked out, but nothing happens for the rest of the post. I still do not know to this day what it was, but it scared the life out of me. I'm thinking it might have been some form of hallucination, but it felt way too real. I know that probably doesn't make sense, but it just kind of didn't feel like something my brain was making up. Now, the second story happened in early 2012. We were still in Helmand Province, but a different, bigger patrol base. 13 men plus Afghan National Army platoon. It was around midnight on this post. The patrol base had gravel lining the whole grounds to keep dust down. It was a poorly built defensive position with blind spots everywhere. I was a little over 6 hours into an 8-hour shift when I heard some gravel crunching just below my post, which is about 10 feet back from inside the wire, i.e. the blind spot. Very unusual because we had an early A in patrol, and everyone but myself, the other post standard, and the one guy on radio watching the command center were sleeping. I call out, "Who's that?" And the crunching stops, and I get no response. I use my radio to call the command center and ask if he was walking about. He tells me no, so I asked him to come check this out, and make sure to tell him to be careful coming around the corner, and have him keep his rifle up, weapon light on, and pop the corner. As I see him walking out of the COC, the gravel crunching sounds pick up again. But this time, rapidly, like someone was running. Once again, high alert adrenaline flowing hardcore. I'm thinking we've got someone inside the wires, so I start yelling stop or I'll shoot in Afghan. The sound stops, and my radial watch pops the corner, ready to shoot, and nothing. There was just nothing there. So, once again, I freaked out. He chalks it up to me being paranoid and lacking sleep, but I'm not so sure. About an hour later, it happens again almost exactly the same way, with nothing being there once more. I have the radio watch and wake up my buddy, and he stands on post with me for the last hour, which passes without incident. I still have no clue what it was. Was it a kid inside the wire somehow? A cat? A dog? A ghost? Who knows? All I know is I have never been more scared than I was during those 2 incidents.